Good morning. You're not very friendly. Before I start, you'll have noticed that Hans has got a really strange accent, all right? And I've noticed that a lot of you have got really strange accents. So this afternoon, when it comes to question time, I want you to speak very slowly and carefully so that I can understand, all right? Because when you get to heaven, you'll all speak like me. Because God's a Scotsman. It's a pleasure here to be here this morning, to begin to talk and to think through some things that I hope are useful, but more so, I hope that they're important. Because Hans has laid a really good foundation about the significance of this for church and society. It's not something that's certainly such a kind of a side issue to the things that church and society should be thinking about. It's something that's at the heart of the gospel and something that's at the heart of any kind of civilized, normal society, whatever normal may turn out to be. So it's good to be here, but I hope that the time we spend here will drive us back to wherever we come from with changed attitudes and changed actions. One of the interesting things in relation to the theology of disability is just how little literature is written on mental health issues. There's lots of stuff on physical disability, lots of stuff on cognitive and intellectual disability, but when it comes to mental health issues, people seem much less willing to engage with the issues. And I wonder why that is. I suspect part of it may be that lurking at the back of our thinking is this connection between the image of God and the intellect that Hans pointed towards. Somehow that there's something about having some kind of mental health problem that impacts who you are as a person, particularly in a society where cognition is considered to be fundamentally important, cognition and intellect. Or it may be that people don't think that disability, the categories of disability fit well within the area of mental health. But what I want to show you this morning is to begin to work with you this morning, is to indicate or to suggest that mental health problems are equally as socially constructed as any other form of disability. When we begin to complexify the situation, when we begin to break them down, you begin to see that, yes, they may have biological or genetic roots, but biology and genetics doesn't determine who or what you are. When you begin to break things down, you begin to see that mental health problems are social constructions. And when you see the social constructions, then your response to them are quite differently. I want to begin with a question which is obvious but important. Why is it that as soon as we think of health and illness, we think of medicine? Why is that? When the majority of healing that goes on within our society goes in your home, in your community, with your friends and so on and so forth, it's a very small aspect of healing and healthcare that goes on within the professional sector. And why is it when we think of mental health problems that automatically we go to psychiatry? Why don't we go to theology? Why don't we go to church? There's something about the way in which we frame mental health problems, something about the kind of culture that we have that draws us to certain models of professionalism which blind us to other aspects. So this morning I want to lay out the complexities of depression in particular, which is something we kind of take for granted and we assume that it has a biological root or a neurological root, which it may have. But even if it does have that, I want to suggest to you there are other ways of understanding depression and other approaches to depression which are significant. And when we're doing that, we can maybe open up the field of mental health studies to a closer investigation and a closer connection with the more general field of disability studies. Susan Sontag talks about illness as entering into a strange land. See, it's like a place where you go when you lose all the maps, all the guidance, all of the assumptions that you had about who you were and where you are. And you go into this land and you have to sit down and you have to totally reassess who, what you are and what the world's about. And I think that's quite a useful way of thinking about depression. Because when we get into that land of depression, and I don't want to use psychiatric language. I have no problem with psychiatry, by the way, but I don't want to use that language. When we enter that land of sadness, of brokenness, when the meaning has emptied from your life, everything looks different. And unless we as pastoral carers and we as people who experience depression begin to realize what's going on within that strange world of depression, then we can't possibly know what it means to address and to bring healing in all of its different forms. Now, the first thing I wanted to bring to mind with you is the strange shape of depression. I'll say a little bit more about this later on in the theological significance, but all illnesses are shaped by the context within which you experience them. Now, if you open a medical textbook, you would assume that all illnesses are pretty much the same wherever you are, whatever culture you're in, whatever part of the world you're in, but they're not. All illnesses are shaped and formed by the context. Take some, for example, if you have a sore throat, for example, you say, I'm not feeling myself today. Now, what does it mean not to feel yourself? What does it mean not to feel yourself? Now, if you can imagine that sometimes you've got a minor infection like that, what would it be like if you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, of bipolar disorder, of depression, or of cancer? If a throat infection brings on a change in your perspective of who you are, how much more will that perspective be changed by bigger diagnoses that have a bigger impact on who you think you are and who the culture thinks you are? So depression is always culturally and contextually bound. You always experience it in a place, and that place is deeply significant for the way that you feel and the way that people should respond. Depression is open to a variety of interpretations depending on what you believe about the world. And that's very, very important, particularly in relation to theology, as we'll see later on. The world and the way that you understand it will determine the way that you experience your depression or any other condition. Depression is open to a variety of interventions depending on how we choose to interpret the experience. And this is important because what I'm not saying is there's any problem with medication. What I'm not saying there's any problem with psychiatry. What I am saying is that theology and the practices of the church have an extremely important part to play in the process of depression, preventing suicide, and the things that we'll be looking at as we move on. In other words, we needn't be determined by the medical model, by medicine, when in fact the theological perspectives are equally as important and significant for understanding and dealing with the issues we're talking about. So depression is culturally bound, contextually bound. Arthur Kleinman, who's a fascinating anthropologist who works at Harvard, you may have come across his book called The Illness Narratives. And in The Illness Narratives, he begins to draw out the significance of the stories that people tell about illness for clinical practice. But way back in the 80s, he did a fascinating study on depression in Taiwan. And what he did is a series of interviews with Taiwanese people, beginning to try to understand what depression looked like within that context. And what he discovered was that within Taiwanese culture, depression and all mental health problems was highly stigmatized. In other words, people didn't want to have it or didn't want to admit that they had it. So therefore, you're most unlikely to go along to your doctor or your psychiatrist and say, I have depression. But people still experience the emotions. But what they did was they somaticized. In other words, they took the experiences of brokenness and sadness and lostness and alienation that mark depression and took it into their bodies. And so therefore they would approach the doctors with vague back pains or stomach pains, things that are culturally acceptable. So they would draw their experience into a standard medical model, embody it, and then ask the doctor to treat that. They still experience the same things that we in Western culture call depression, but because of the context, it was very different. And it's interesting when you look at the literature on general practitioners, or as you guys have here, family practitioners, because a good deal of time that's taken up by family practitioners is with people coming in with vague aches, backaches, stomach aches, and so on and so forth. The somaticization of particular personal experiences of brokenness. In other words, if a family practitioner simply reads the physiological signs, they can actually miss what is actually going on within the emotional experience of the individual. So the culture and the context that you experience depression is significant. Brown and Harris are two British researchers developed way back in the 70s a model of depression called a social model of depression. It began in London, and it was beginning to explore why it was that single-parent mothers, which was the focus of the studies, became depressed in disproportionately amounts to other married couples. And they discovered that the main reason that single mothers became depressed is because they became isolated. They became isolated from their communities, they became simply focused on their families, and then something went wrong within their family, their child got into trouble at school, or didn't achieve the expectations that the mother had hoped for. She's isolated, she's lonely, so therefore she becomes depressed. And in a series of studies, they began to explore how you address that, and effectively the way that you address that is ensuring that young mothers have social networks, in particular friendships. And they decided to test this in the late 80s by moving the context from inner city London to Scotland. Scotland. Have you guys ever been to Scotland? Good. Yeah. Your salvation is secured. But, well, Amos, I don't know. You're a Pentecostalist. So they shifted, they did a very similar study on a little island just off the coast of Scotland called the Hebrides Island. And at that time, the Hebrides was a crofting culture. It was a very close community of crofters, small farms that looked after kind of plots of land. The church within that situation was central. Everybody went to church. And they did the same experiment, or the same research with these guys. And they discovered very clearly that women who were involved with church communities were protected from depression and anxiety for the same kind of reasons as the women in a city, London. And so there's something about community, something about the ability of women to relate in community that protected them from depression. But what's really interesting is within the Hebrides and within that whole area, actually, of Scotland, the research seems to indicate that men get depressed. The men have feelings of lostness and loneliness, partly to do with the changes in the economy and various other things. But what do? Do they go to church, where a place where they're going to be protected from depression because they can find relationships? No, they don't. They drink and they fight. Okay? So women seek out relationships, men drink and fight. And I can almost guarantee that wherever you come from, you'll find a very similar phenomenon. And there's something that, certainly in my context, and you guys can work out whether it's the same for you, and it's to do with the feminization of spirituality. There's lots of research literature that says if you become involved with a religious community, you'll be protected from depression. But it's women that go to religious communities, say the real men. In other words, there's a general cultural assumption that spirituality and religion, however you want to define these things, are things that are not for real men. They're things that women do. And so therefore, in all of our cultures, and this is a very Western phenomenon, in all of our cultures there is a tendency for men to take other actions. And as we'll see, some of these other actions are quite deadly. So the context and the culture and the cultural expectations of the place that you experience your depression are fundamentally important. They're not secondary, they're not epiphenomenal, they're fundamentally important for what depression is. So what I want to suggest is that what we need to do when we're thinking about depression is to learn the grammar of depression. So there's cultural grammar, i.e. there's that way of reading culture that helps us to see that actually some things within culture are highly significant for what depression is, and also sometimes for causing depression. But I also want to begin to learn the theological grammar, that when we listen to the experience of depression, there's something important theologically that goes on in the midst of all of that. A few years ago, we did a study on the lived experience of depression. And we used a phenomenological approach, which really was trying to move beyond diagnosis, accepting diagnosis, but moving beyond it to the actual experience of people with depression. And asking that question, what does it feel like? What is it like for you? Not what is it like for you as a category or a diagnosis. What's it like for you to experience depression? And it was fascinating, because when you listen to that deep experience, everything changes. It looks quite different. I'll give you some examples. This was a woman who had long-term depression. And she describes her depression as being in an abyss, a deep, dark pit. When I'm in a phase that I'm able to believe that there's a God who gives meaning to that universe, then I have hope. But there have been spells when I haven't been able to believe that, and that has been absolutely terrifying. That's been falling into the abyss, and that's seriously nasty. And the way that she described it was this. When she was in that abyss, she could look up, and sometimes she would see light, but sometimes she would see nothing but darkness. And the walls of that pit were lined with some kind of greasy substance that means she can't get out in any way. And what she said, and this is significant, she says, when I'm in there, I don't want somebody to jump in there and sit beside me. I want somebody to pull me out. Now, oftentimes as pastors and pastoral carers, we say, well, let's just sit beside this person and it'll be all right. She said, I don't want that. She wanted medication, in other words, to take her out. She also wanted presence and medication. But it's the way that she described her experience when she was well that I thought was particularly significant. Because when she was well, she said that she walked round the edge of the abyss. And she looked into the abyss, knowing that at any moment in time, she could fall back into that abyss. So even when she was well, the fear of being unwell was always there. And so she was either in the dark pit or she was looking into the dark pit. And that's a really difficult place to be. And she says the idea of suicide is the most rational thing in the world when you're going through all that pain. It's the people who try to stop you that think they're off their heads. Why would you want to go on living if you felt like that? And I think that's quite important, really, because sometimes we think suicide is an illogical thing that's caused by pathology. But actually, if you're living your life in the way that she described it, you can see why, without justifying the action, you can see exactly why she was tempted to think about putting a stop to it. Now, the question, of course, is why didn't she? She says, I want to kill myself, but I can't because God won't let me. I'm very angry with God for that. Now, what's interesting there is the theological dynamic, because she was an evangelical Christian who had a real fear of hell. Now, pastorally, we may say, well, that's an unhealthy, unhelpful belief, or we may not say that, but just say we did say that. In her situation, it was that very, some would say unhealthy, unhelpful belief that saved her life. It was because she believed that at least at that moment in time, she was able to not do that. Now, if you think about it, if you took your particular theology, whatever your theology of the afterlife might be, into a pastoral situation, try to dissuade her of that image of God, then the risk would be that by persuading her that that image of God is wrong and that a different image is more helpful, you actually open up the possibility that that which is preventing her from committing suicide is no longer there. So reading the theological grammar of the pastoral encounter is really very, very important skill to learn. And that's why theology is fundamentally important for how we understand depression, alongside other forms of knowledge. One of the things that the phenomenon, which is it? It was one of them. Yeah, you don't know. One of the one of these things that's happening throughout Western Europe is there is an incredible, well, two things happening. Once there's a real movement towards secularization. People no longer seem to be interested in traditional religion in the way that they were once, and there's a kind of a general movement towards spirituality broadly defined, whatever that may be. But underneath that, and alongside of that, there's an incredible rise in the rate of suicide amongst young people, in particular amongst young men. And I want us to think about why that might be, because it ties into where we've been and where we're going. In my own context, the biggest increase has taken place in Scotland amongst men under the age of 34, and suicide is now responsible for more deaths of young men in Scotland than road traffic accidents. More than half of the 600 suicides in Scotland each year now occur in men under 44, and rates are twice as high as those in England and Wales. Higher levels of poverty and unemployment in Scotland are considered to be important factors behind the increase. But I can guarantee you that if you go to any part of any city in any country, you'll find the same dynamic. There's a sense of lostness. If you look particularly at Australia, you look across Europe, there's a sense of lostness that seems to be overpowering young people. And I want us to think a little bit about what that means, because it has spiritual significance. One of the key things, of course, is that those who are committing suicide are not all people who have diagnosable mental health problems. So I want us to think about what that might mean. So why are these young people taking their lives? Clearly they're becoming depressed and something is happening. Loss of traditional roles. One of the things that we notice is that the place where people are most likely to reside who take their own lives is within lower working class families within which there's been radical changes in the family over the past 20 to 30 years. Traditionally, the man has been the head of the house and has had a clear role. With the women's movement, quite rightly, women's roles have changed, and so therefore also have men's roles. But it's very unclear for many men within families, within these communities, what it means to be a man. What it means to be head of the house without being head of the house in that traditional way, that rather oppressive way. And so the negotiation of traditional roles that's going on just now. Losses of social support, similar to what I've been saying. There was a time when the church was a place where even men went. Now that doesn't happen. And there's a tendency for people to go to the pub, but if you're unemployed, you don't have money to go to the pub, so therefore where do you find social connections? The answer is, you don't. Loss of a sense of meaning and purpose, and that's to do with unemployment as well as relational disconnection. In a capitalist society like ours, where do you get your source of value? You get your source of value from your work. You meet somebody, what's the first thing you say to them? Oh, what do you do for a living? They tell you, and then you place them in a hierarchy as to whether that's important or not important to you. The key thing being that your social identity is shaped by your work. If you're unemployed, if you have no social support, if you're not sure of what your role is in the family, then exactly who are you? And you move into what Durkheim talked about is that sense of anomie, that sense of not having any boundaries, not boundlessness, not knowing who you are, and then you just make a move. Loss of employment, confusion over identity, and a culture of suicide. And that's quite interesting. I don't know if you've noticed that if a child in a school, for example, commits suicide, they send in counsellors. And one of the reasons they send in counsellors, not just to help people with their grief, but it's to prevent a culture of suicide emerging. In other words, once one person has done it, it becomes an option for other people. Before that, it wasn't an option, but as soon as one person has done it, it's an option. And that's one of the reasons why you sometimes get that running in communities, sometimes you get it running in families, because as soon as somebody's done it, it's a possibility. And it seems to me, certainly within the context of Western Europe, it becomes an option. It becomes a possibility. Now, when you look at these reasons why people become depressed and commit suicide, it's profound loss of meaning. I think, and we can discuss this later on, but it's something very deeply tied in with the movement towards secularization throughout Europe. And you see exactly the same thing in Australia, and I suspect that you'll begin to see it here. And nothing to replace it. You take God away, and then you leave people to their own, to be judged by their own abilities, and then suddenly you find that they can't do what was promised to them, so therefore what have you got? So although it looks like a sociocultural issue, although it looks like a psychological, psychiatric issue, actually I think it's a spiritual issue that relates to the way in which we choose to structure our societies and the priorities that we give within our societies. And so what can we do? We've reframed depression, we've kind of deconstructed it, we've looked at the way in which the cultural and the spiritual come together. And the one thing that we can see, I would suggest to you, is that the church has a profoundly important role, however you define church. But that which is the bearer of a message of meaning and purpose and possibilities beyond that which is obvious has a profoundly important role. Psychiatry has an important role, but so does the church. So what can we do? We, in this case, being the church. William Breitbart, who's a psychotherapist who works in Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York, he specializes in end-of-life care, and he developed a very interesting program of assistance for people right at the end of their lives. He noticed that when people got to the end of their lives, they tended to ask physicians to take their lives. physician-assisted suicide. And he wasn't happy with that. He's a secular Jew, so he wasn't coming from a religious perspective, but he realized that there's something else that was going on. And so what he did was he set up meaning-centered groups. That is, groups of people who came together to discuss spiritual issues. And that included religious people and non-religious people working through issues of what's important and what's not important in their lives. And what he noticed is that when these groups began to do that, and people began to discover that even at the end of your life, when you apparently have nothing to hope for, there are things to hope for, the requests for assisted suicide stopped. Because the reason that people were asking for it was because they felt there was a burden, they couldn't see any possibility, they couldn't see any meaning in their life, and so on and so forth. As soon as he addressed these spiritual issues, the request for assisted suicides stopped, more or less. In other words, rather than wrestling with the ethical question, should a person be assisted to take their own life, he addressed the wider community and spiritual issues, and in addressing these issues, the ethical question didn't arise. Now, I think there's something important in there for when we're thinking about depression and when we're thinking about the kind of issues with suicide we've been talking about. Perhaps rather than dealing with the crises, important as these are, maybe what we need to do is to develop a culture wherein people can A, experience sadness well, and B, be enabled to have meaning and purpose and hope, even in a situation, a cultural situation, where that might seem to be impossible. And that's why I think the church, as a community that only exists in order to give the possibility of purpose, meaning, and hope, is fundamentally important. So as I move towards the end of what I'm going to say to you, there are a number of practices that I want us to think about. Now, when I talk about practices, Christian practices are embodied theology. They're things that we do that reveal something of God. So for example, the practice of the Eucharist, at one level, just looks like we're taking bread and wine and eating bread and wine. But when you reflect theologically on the practice of the Eucharist, it takes you right back to the heart of the Passion. It takes you right back to the cross, to the resurrection, the possibility of redemption. So that which seems like a day-to-day action actually becomes something that's profoundly salvific. Likewise, Christian friendship, you begin to talk about friendship, and in our culture, friendship tends to be, well, I like you, we've got lots of things in common, so therefore let's be common. When you begin to take the idea of friendship into the life of Jesus, you see something different. Jesus, who sits with the marginalized, those who are radically unlike him, the incarnation principle God, who is radically unlike human beings, enters into relationship. And so the day-to-day practices that we engage in reveal something of who we are and who God is. And one practice that I think we've forgotten is a practice of sadness. It seems to me pretty clear that we live in a death-denying culture, a culture wherein people don't know what to do with sadness, and the church doesn't know what to do with sadness. If you think about it, when was the last time that you had a sermon preached on sadness and lament? The temptation is for us to preach happiness. So therefore, sadness sits alien to what the community is and alien to what we think the heart of the gospel should be. But I want to suggest to you that that's a mistake. The book of Psalms, God's prayer book of the Bible, more than anything else within the book of Psalms are the Psalms of lament. There's more lament psalms than anything else. And so one of the first things I want to do is to reclaim the fact that God gives us language within which to express sadness. Now, the interesting thing about the lament psalms is they were intended not only to allow people to express anger and rage, as I'll talk to you about in a moment, but also to shape people's suffering. The Psalms of Lament, particularly, there's two types. There's the communal Psalms of Lament and there's the personal Psalms of Lament. The personal Psalms of Lament were intended for people who had been violated or broken or somehow had suffered evil and suffering. And they were a way in which they were rehabilitated back into the community. So they were giving a language that accepted and recognized the sadness and brokenness, but at the same time allowed them a way to express that in language which is appropriate. Now, I have a book here called the Bible. We use it in Scotland. Do you guys use it over here? It's very helpful. Yeah, They don't use it in Holland, though, Hans, is that right? Let me read you a lament psalm. O Lord, how long will you forget me forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul and sorrow in my heart every day? How long will my enemy have the upper hand? Turn and answer me, O God. Restore the sparkle to my eyes, or I will die. Don't let my enemies gloat, saying, we have defended him. Don't let them rejoice in my downfall. But I trust in your unfailing love. I will rejoice because you have rescued me. I will sing to the Lord because he's good to me. See the shape of that psalm? It acknowledges sadness. It acknowledges brokenness as part of the community, and it speaks it out in all of its rawness. But it does it in the context of prayer. And the key part is here. But I trust in your unfailing love. I will rejoice because of you. It's that little Hebrew word, hesed, that's the key. Because all of the Psalms, with the exception of 1 or 2, Psalm 88, for example, come back and say, God, you've broken the covenant. God, this is terrible, but I trust in your unfailing love. In other words, sadness is brought into the community, and it's expressed in all of its rawness and brokenness, but in a context of hope. So a fundamental practice of sadness is to begin to develop communities that handle sadness well, and the lament gives us a place to begin there. Secondly, we need to move beyond idolizing Jesus. Now, what I mean by that is, I don't know what your experience of pastors is. I'm sure this doesn't apply to any of you here at any point, but there is a temptation for pastors in particular to be afraid of their emotions, to be afraid to reveal their sadness, to be afraid to feel the brokenness. It's probably one of the reasons why so many pastors break down. And to create an image of Jesus which is big and strong and masculine in that way, and which ignores precisely what Hans was talking about yesterday and what Paul talks about in Corinthians, that to know God is to know weakness, to know brokenness, to be laughed at, to be scorned. So creating communities which lament, but also creating communities which properly represent the fullness of Jesus is fundamentally important. Now, what I'm talking here is not only in terms of preventing depression, but also given a context where depression is not stigmatized by the very community within which healing is being sought. If day to day we became communities like this and model these things, then depression would look quite differently when we encounter it. Reiterating success, that's not particularly important. But basically it just means get your priorities right. That which is successful in the world is not that which is successful in the kingdom of God, but we can talk about that maybe later on. Penultimately, creating spaces for community. It's very clear from the literature, and I've tried to give you an indication of why, that people within religious communities tend to be protected from depression. In other words, we're made for relationships. When we can't find relationships, depression becomes a possibility. Even if we aren't predisposed to it in any other way, it becomes a possibility for all of us. And one really interesting initiative in Australia just now is, it's kind of called a shed initiative. You may have come across it. But within Australian culture, there's a huge, and it's worse than within UK or Europe, huge rise and increase in suicide amongst young men. And one of the traditional things one of the traditional places that men meet in Australian culture is in the shed. They go down to the bottom of the garden and they hang around in the shed and they meet their friends and so on and so forth. And so what they've done is they've created in each community a big shed. And men go down there and they make things and they sit around and they smoke and they just become friends with one another in that context. And it's working. Men are being relocated, reunited with their relationality, and the suicide rate is being decreased by that. Now, it seems to me that the essence of the church is to become a shed, to become a safe place where men and women can go and begin to find that possibility that the relationality that you see very clearly in the image of God as laid out in Genesis, the Genesis account of creation, becomes a reality. And that we can kind of overcome our false sense of individualism and become shed people, if you like. So it's a shared missionary venture, or shared evangelism, or whatever way you want to put it. Creating safe spaces where we can begin to connect. The final, well, actually, it's not the final. It's one more thing I want to say to you after this. In general, in relation to depression, what I've been saying to you is that you need psychiatry and you need medicine, but you also need theology and the church community. The two are complementary rather than doing different things. But the way that our culture is formed, the assumption is that we need nothing but medicine. Gerald Kaplan, a British psychiatrist, developed a very useful way of beginning to approach depression within that framework. And he describes them as Kaplan groups. Kaplan groups have to do with pastors and pastoral carers who encounter mental health problems within their communities. And they recognize that they have things to offer, but that their gifts are only going to work if they can be able to form a matrix of healing and caring. And so what Kaplan groups do is they bring together pastors, theologians, psychiatrists, and psychologists who meet regularly to discuss pastoral issues. And each one takes very seriously the integrity of the other discipline, so that the individual is genuinely treated in a holistic manner. I know holistic is a funny word that has all sorts of different meanings. But what I mean is that the different perspectives that I've been trying to lay down to you on mental health problems in general and depression in particular are addressed regularly within the patterning of the church's pastoral ministry through this idea of interlocking with Kaplan groups. And I think that's something to think about. And finally, I think we need to develop a practical theology of sadness. Paul says in Romans 8, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." And I think that's a fundamental text for people who are depressed. I think it's a fundamental text for people who are left behind after the act of suicide has been successful. And I think it's a fundamental text for the church to live out and to practice as it begins to rethink and reframe mental health issues in precisely the way that I've been trying to give you some indications of how that might be done. But I want you to hold on to that text because I think it's actually very, very important, not just for what I'm talking about, but actually for what we've been talking about throughout the rest of the week. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to talking later.